it on? This is Joel Goldsmith. Beginning October 22nd, 1951. Good morning, friends.
Good morning.
Good afternoon, friends.
Good afternoon.
Now, this is a point that you must note. And this is going to be one of the key points in our entire work. It is the activity of truth in consciousness that performs our miracles. I'll repeat that. It is the activity of truth in consciousness that performs our miracles. By that I mean this, that if you were to sit here from now until doomsday, nothing would happen except day would follow night and night would follow day, and we'd gradually get older and ultimately die. If anything good, if anything spiritual, if anything of God is to happen, it must happen as the result of the activity of truth in our consciousness. Now, that activity of truth comes about in many, many ways. There have been ways of desperation. That is, when a person is in deep and dire trouble, sometimes that trouble goes so deep into their soul that with all sincerity and integrity they cry out, "Oh God, oh God." And they may not necessarily mean, "Oh God, take my pain away." They really mean, "Oh God, if I could only see God or know God, if God could only be made." And in the depth of that desperation, which really is an activity of truth and consciousness, there it is. You see, the word God, opening up consciousness to God, brings about a miracle, sometimes of healing or of any nature. In the same way, as we learn to open our consciousness to truth, as we keep truth consciously active in our consciousness, the miracles of life appear. For instance, we are, well, now, I'm sure you'll agree that this morning we were active in truth and consciousness, weren't we? We had 2 hours in which the errors of the world did not get in too deep into our thought. We were able to keep them pretty well outside because we were actively engaged in the activity of truth, entertaining truth in our consciousness. Here we are this afternoon again. Tonight we'll be at it again. Not only there isn't much room left today for error to make much of an inroad into our consciousness, but the amount of truth that we are actively maintaining in consciousness is automatically dispelling some of the illusions of sense, so that it would not be surprising any kind of a healing or miracle could take place in the consciousness of any one of us. Because just think of the hours and hours today when error is really of not too much moment or concern, and truth is uppermost, and above all, we are opening our consciousness to truth. You are sitting there with both ears opened and strained for every word of truth that comes through, and I'm just as open and strained up here for every word to come through, since I'm not talking to you about anything that I know or anything that I said last week or last month or last year. As a matter of fact, I would be very happy if no word repeated itself this whole week, if a whole new unfoldment would come through, even in new language. And so every bit of me is open and alert, not only while I'm on the platform, but all night and all day, throughout the whole period of this class, I'll be constantly alert, paying very little attention to what's being said to me, but always open for whatever it is that the Father is imparting for our purpose. Now, because we are so alert, would it be strange if anything happened to us, something should happen to us, like happened to me after a San Francisco class? I was driving from San Francisco home to Hollywood, and I had given an afternoon class and an evening class and some Sunday lectures. And of course I was just filled with this truth that had been coming through for weeks. And while driving home in my car, I heard the voice distinctly say, "He performeth that which is given me to do." And it repeated itself 3 times. "He performeth that which is given me to do." And I said, "All right, Father, I don't care what it is you give me to do, as long as I know that you are already performing it." Well, I got home, and my wife told me that it would be another half hour before dinner would be ready. And I went to my study, and at 10 minutes of 2, just 20 minutes later, the telephone bell rang, and it was Honolulu on the phone saying, "Come at once, Fred has been given up to die." And immediately came back this thing, "He performeth that which is given me to do." I said, "Sure, I'll come, but don't worry, the work is done." And 5 weeks later, that man was declared completely healed. Now, it was no real miracle. It was really a natural thing, that having consciousness so filled with truth, being so open and alert, that at a moment of need the still small voice should come in, not only with its presence, but with its power, not merely to tell me that he performeth that which is given me to do, but actually to perform it. So it is with us. Good will come into your experience, and I mean spiritual good, infinite good, permanent good. But it will only come into your experience in proportion as you permit the activity of truth to have sway in your consciousness. You can't expect just to get up out of bed in the morning and be a good human being and tend to your good human duties and go to bed and sleep at night still a good human being and expect some spiritual miracle to take place, because you haven't made room for it. If you will notice in the history of your Bible or spiritual literature, that the miracle, the spiritual miracles, always took place in the minds of people whose mind were open to God, whose consciousness was open to God. Rarely did it happen in the minds of other people. And so we have as a basic theme always that the good that is to come into your experience must come as a result of the activity of truth maintained and sustained in your consciousness. You don't have to tell God what you need. You don't have to ask God to solve your problem. No. That's holding the problem, and that's holding the need in mind. We don't do that. All we concern ourselves with is the maintaining of the activity of truth in our consciousness, keeping that ear open in the state of receptivity, always expecting to hear the still small voice. Not what they call in metaphysics the expectancy of good, that is always expecting a check to come in or expecting a new house to come along or expecting a... No. Ours is not that kind of expectancy of good. Ours is an expectancy of good in the form of a spiritual activity, the still small voice, spiritual teaching, a demonstration of God's love. We'll come to that too. And so it is that all we did this morning, all we're doing now, is opening consciousness that the activity of truth may hold sway there. All we do when we read is open our consciousness to the truth that's embodied in those books. All we do when we meditate is open our consciousness to the truth already embodied in our consciousness. You see, The truth is already embodied in your consciousness. Never forget that. The truth isn't outside, and you are not taking it in. The truth is already within you. Even the truth I'm speaking is already within you, or you wouldn't recognize it. It's already within you. You are opening your consciousness to it. Now, I'm going to read to you from this book, Man and God. It's a compilation of spiritual excerpts from all time and all saints, sages, seers of all religions and so philosophies, and it's a nice compilation of them, good compilation. This particular poem is by that marvelous mystic Edward Carpenter, and well, it'll explain itself. It's called The Lake of Beauty. Let your mind be quiet, realizing the beauty of the world and the immense, the boundless treasures that it holds in store. All that you have within you, all that your heart desires, all that your nature so specially fits you for, that or the counterpart of it waits embedded in the great whole for you. It will surely come to you. Yet equally surely, not one moment before its appointed time will it come. All your crying and fever and reaching out of hands will make no difference. Therefore, do not begin that game at all. Do not recklessly spill the waters of your mind in this direction and that, lest you become like a spring lost and dissipated in the desert. But draw them together into a little compass and hold them still, so still, and let them become clear, so limpid, so mirror-like. At last, the mountains and the sky shall glass themselves in peaceful beauty, and the antelope shall descend to drink and to gaze at his reflected image, and the lion to quench his thirst. And love himself shall come and bend over and catch his own likeness in you. You remember that this morning I said that the secret of the ages is embodied in those two words, I am. And so as you develop that tranquility of consciousness that is not feverishly trying to make something happen or anxious because it isn't happening or concerned because you want it to happen, and you will let the divine mind unfold in you, the divine love unfold and reveal itself in you in its way, in its time, in its manner, meanwhile doing those things that are given you to do each moment, you will find that the great secret of harmony is in permitting God to unfold and develop, realize itself as your experience. It isn't your responsibility. This life isn't your responsibility. This life is God. And this life is God's responsibility, unfolding and disclosing, revealing itself, just as God reveals itself in the harmonies of the sky. Just as God reveals itself in the harmony of your garden, so God reveals itself in the harmony of your individual life. The only difference has been that we have permitted this belief of a selfhood apart from God to take root within us, and then we use the word I erroneously. And we say, I must do this, I must accomplish this, I have only so much time in which to do this, I haven't sufficient supply with which to do this, I require or need this. And you see, that I you're talking about couldn't produce these things if it had the whole world to work with. That is why in one of my classworks you will find a chapter devoted to the subject that I is a devil. Yes, I is a devil. That I that has any concern for tomorrow, that I that believes it must support itself, feed itself, sustain itself, educate itself, that I is a devil, and it will mislead you and take you away from your spiritual demonstration, since that I is not the reality of your being. The I, which is the reality of your being, is God. The I at the center of your being is God. The I which you declare when you say the word I. That I, even though you're thinking of it as Joel, that I is God. And that I fulfills itself on earth as Joel, but only if Joel doesn't get in the way and say, what shall I do tomorrow, or where shall I go tomorrow, or how shall I find patients tomorrow, or how shall I find students or customers tomorrow. Then that false sense of I trips up my entire demonstration. But if I say, I is living its life as Joel, and that I knows where it's going and why, that I knows its ultimate destiny, and Joel will just stand by and watch it unfold day by day. Everything necessary to Joel's unfoldment will appear by divine grace, because the I that I am, the all-knowing mind, is about its own business of fulfilling itself as my experience. And heaven help my demonstration when I get in the way and say, I would like to go here, or I would like to go there. That is why we have these seeming contradictions in my experience, where I say to someone, I don't think I will have any more classes this year. And then immediately the word gets all around, Joel Goldsmith isn't going to have any more classes this year, and then all of a sudden he bobs up in Portland, Oregon with a class. Well, of course, if I wanted to be obstinate, and if I wanted to be consistent, I'd say, no, I said I wouldn't have any, and I won't. But who am I to say any such thing as that? If there are 20, 30, 40 people who say, I want it, who am I to say no? If I remember that I'm the servant of God, then I say yes. And so it is. It makes no difference. When I went to the island, someone said, how long are you going to be there? Well, I don't really know. Could be a week. It could be, I said, I don't know. It might be the balance of the year. So when I got there, someone said, well, you told me you weren't going to come back this year. Well, maybe I did. Certainly I had no idea of coming back. I came back because of these tape recordings, and I did not know that I would have to come back. But the point that I make is this, that when we are sufficiently loose so that we're not bound to anything that we said yesterday or may say today or tomorrow, but are always willing to let that spirit work through, then we will find that it has a will and it has a way. That's why the Master could say, not my will, thine be done. Now, as far as I see the light and see it, I say to myself, well, this is the work I'm doing today, and I have promised to go to Seattle and have 2 classes there. Not closed classes, just these open lecture classes. And so far as I know, that finishes my work for this year. But don't be surprised if you get a postal card from England or Germany or Honolulu again, because that is the way I've been accustomed to working since 1909. I don't have a personal will. I like to be wherever I am and do whatever I have to do. But this applies in every activity of life, whether it's that or whether it's supply. Now, as a matter of fact, I must be as important to God as God is important to me, since we are one. The place whereon I stand is holy ground. And therefore, if it is God that created me, it must be as important to God to maintain me and sustain me as it is to me to be maintained and sustained. And therefore we're taught in Scripture the government is on his shoulder. He performeth that which is given me to do. And again it says, he perfecteth that which concerneth me. He perfecteth that which concerneth me. But we must come to an attitude of mind in which we permit the he of our being, the I of our being, to do that. And so that I that would be great in and of itself, that I that claims personal powers, that I that's always doing this, that, or the other thing, let us watch out for that I, because it may get us into deep trouble. Whereas the I that I truly am already is. In the same book, there are a few quotations on the subject of humility that bear this out. And this is from Blake of England. O Savior, pour upon me thy spirit of meekness and love. Annihilate the selfhood in me. Be thou all my life. Guide thou my hand, which trembles exceedingly upon the rock of ages. And then St. Francis of Assisi, right next to it, says, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console. Not that I seek to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Yes, as we die to that personal sense of self, as we permit that personal sense of self to be annihilated, then in that degree does the I that I am take over, and we have that transitional experience I spoke of this morning, when the Christ moves in and takes over mind, soul, and body, and lives our lives, and we just stand around and watching the wonderful miracles that happen to us day by day. That is the goal of the infinite way, of the message of the infinite way, to bring us to a state of consciousness, to a state of transition, where we can say, I live, yet not I, Christ liveth in me. Where there is the Father within that lives our life, goes before us, supplies us, gives us our activity, and even performs that which is given us to do. You can see that this does not mean sitting around in dullness and deadness of mind or thought, waiting for something to happen, even though we can't hurry it by a moment. But we can keep our consciousness open and alert to the activity of truth, so that at every, and this of course is a mode of operation, at every appearance or suggestion of error that comes to us, whether through person, radio, newspaper, gossip, rumor, every suggestion of error that comes to us must immediately meet with an activity of truth in our consciousness. In other words, you cannot walk on the street and let a drunken person pass you or a crippled person pass you without it bringing out an activity of truth in your consciousness as a response. You can't, I don't mean to look for trouble. I mean that when it impinges itself upon you, when it touches or thrusts itself upon your consciousness and you're aware of it, then at that moment must you also be aware of the activity of truth, which is a refutation of what you're seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, or smelling. Every time you see a headline in the newspaper, every time you hear a headline on the radio, is the opportunity for your activity. Of course, this, if you haven't already found it, you certainly will find it, that as time goes on, the more your mind is awake to the spiritual truth of being, the less newspapers you will read, the less radios you will listen to, the less movie shows you will see. That is an experience I'm sure many of you have already had, the rest of you will have, but all eventually will come to the place where they play practically no part in your existence at all, almost as if they've never been invented or discovered. I suppose that if I see a newspaper once in 6 weeks, that would be about my average, and the only time I hear a radio is if I find a station that has some nice, calm, dreamland music. I love it. And for an hour, a half hour before retiring at night, or by waking up at night, or sometime even in the afternoon if there is any, I like to listen to a short program of calming music, peaceful music. And that is where the radio begins and ends for me, and that's where the newspaper begins or ends for me. And for this reason, there are those in the world who are at that level of consciousness where they have a great part to play in the human picture. They may be the doctors, and they may be the nurses, and they may be the soldiers, and they may be heads of committees to right public wrongs and to perform public services, the Florence Nightingales of the world, and the Mrs. Maud Ballington Booths of the world. Believe me, they are important men and women in their places, and they perform a great and constructive work in the world, just as our founding fathers did in setting up the Constitution of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, and all of these things. Let no one underestimate the human activity of good, because it is really a spiritual activity being performed at a human level. Now, as we engage in this work, we may be called on to do some of those works, but as time goes on, we do less and less of them in the outer world and more of them on the inner world. You will ultimately find that the spiritual knowing of the truth will bring about greater reforms in the world than the fellows who head the active human movements. In other words, the work that Jesus Christ did on earth for 3 years has had and will continue to have more effect in bringing about the brotherhood of man than all of the men and women that went out and got themselves killed in that cause, than all of the ministers who preach it from the platform. In other words, he said, the worlds will fall away, but not my words. And so it is. The principle of love and the principle of life will never fall away. And as long as there is an individual to entertain this truth as an activity of consciousness, it will be made manifest on earth. Now then, we are of those who will gradually do less of human work out in the world. We'll do more of spiritual work within our own being, but the spiritual work that we do within us will appear outwardly and will even inspire those men and women outwardly to works that they never dreamed of. I told you the story of General MacArthur, who did not realize why he had been fired or why he had been called on to do this work until weeks and weeks, months later, it dawned on him, why, I was kicked out of the army so that I could save the country from another war. He didn't know how that happened. He didn't know it was going to happen. He didn't know. There was a power much higher than a man. It just so happened that he had a consciousness open and receptive. Why? Because he's a man of patriotism, because he's a man of love of country, he's a man who's devoted himself to whatever his job was, and it's always been on the constructive side of his particular field. And it's always been with patriotic reasons. I'm sure that even those who will speak of General MacArthur as an egotist and a man who loves the limelight, there is no one who will ever say one word against his character, against his integrity, against his love of country. And of course that can't be said for his superiors. Whatever else might be said about them, we can't attribute to them integrity or love of country. And so it had to be a man like that, a man with a passionate love of country, a man with a passionate integrity toward his nation and toward the safety of his people, who would catch from the spiritual world the impulse to go out and do and be, and he caught it. Rest assured, it wouldn't be one of those who were selling us down the river that caught that impulse. It would have to be one inspired on the human plane, remember, with this love of justice and nation. And so it is, who knows what spiritual activity takes place in your consciousness that inspires some individual out in the political world or world of statesmanship or world of commerce or world of trade unions to do and be. When I was working doing this work in San Francisco for a year, I was in and out a good bit of the time. It so happened that the wife of a president of one of the large unions received a healing through the work. And the nature of the healing was such that it attracted the attention of her husband so that he knew unmistakably that it had happened, although he had no interest himself in metaphysics. So that when a strike came into his industry, one of his industries, and went on for 4 months and no settlement, he finally was inspired to pick up the telephone and say, "Why can't that work of yours settle this strike?" And 24 hours later, there was no strike. The strike was over and it was settled. It was a direct result of his conduct, because they had that day refused a settlement. They that night refused a settlement. And then after a third conversation with me, he went back and asked them for another meeting. And at the third meeting, on the first ballot, the settlement took place on the terms of the first meeting. It was a direct result of the activity of truth that brought about the settlement of that strike. Now then, who knows where some activity of truth in your consciousness will be instrumental in the stopping of a strike or the stopping of a war or the bringing about of a new discovery or some other activity, because there are those out in the world, even on the human level, who are people of integrity. Not only human integrity, but deep down within them, they have a feeling or realization that there is God and that God is a help. And those people are receptive and responsive to your prayers. Now, you don't have to know their name, and you don't have to know their identity, and you don't have to know what mission they should fulfill. As a matter of fact, if you did, you'd probably be trying to direct your human will in their direction, and that's not good. It is better that we do not know even who these people are or what part they should play, but when we, for instance, see an incident such as, just to use an example, let us take Korea. We've been watching that now for months and months and months. And I'm sure everyone that knows about it will agree that it's not right, that there is not justice going on there is not mercy, there is not truth, there is not divine love. Something is wrong in Denmark, in that particular spot in the world, so that it would not be wrong for us, in our capacity as the Christ of God, to pray about it. And how? To realize that the only thing that's operating there is the arm of flesh. The only thing that's operating there is human will, mad ambition, false desire, all of the different qualities of what we call mortal mind. That's what's operating there. But now the question comes in, is that power? And looking at the scene, of course, it appears to have a lot of power. Oh, it appears to have great power. It seems to be that it's holding up peace, it's holding up the safety and security of the boys that are there, and a lot more that are going to be shipped there. It looks as if it were endangering the whole peace of the world. Judging by appearances, this, just to use one word, bestiality of the human mind that's exemplified in Korea, seems to be a power. And here's where we come in. We sit back with our 32nd chapter of 2 Chronicles, verses 7 and 8, and we say, they have only the arm of flesh. We have the Lord God Almighty to fight our battles. Is the arm of flesh power, or is the Lord God Almighty, is this activity of truth in our consciousness the real power? And so we sit there and give ourselves a treatment, if you will. We pray the prayer of realization, the realization of God as the one power and as the only power, and as a revelation of the truth that there is no power in anything apart from God, from the divine love, from the divine heart, the divine soul, the divine spirit, and that all else is and must be proven illusion. And you know, as we continue in that way, one of these sweet days, Korea will dissolve as a problem and will reappear as an opportunity to show forth the glory of God. Someday Korea will show forth. One of these days our prayers will click, and Korea will no longer be a problem. It will be an opportunity. And so it is as we think of these hot spots in the world that may be causing trouble, Iran, Egypt, England now with its election coming. We don't have to judge, you and I, whether Churchill will be the best premier or Mr. Attlee will be. We don't have to judge whether the Labour Party ultimately will be the best party or the Conservative Party. As a matter of fact, that isn't quite your business or mine even to have an opinion about it, because very often the thing which looks the worst today may turn out to be the best. I think there was a time in the history of the American colonies when it would have looked to us, if we'd been sitting there, as pretty bad thing for those revolutionaries to win the war and overthrow the mother country and the mother government. And we'd have probably called them, some of us would anyhow, a lot of band of revolutionaries. They ought to be hung, disturbing the peace and going to war with so forth and so on. To a lot of people, the revolutionaries look like the bad side. I don't have to remind you, it was recent enough, of the Civil War and how many were convinced that the northern side was all wrong and that it was going to wreck and ruin the South and what it was going to do and what it was going to do to the world. And I'm sure that even a reasonable Southerner today will admit that as bad as it was at the time and as much as it might have wrecked his own immediate family, that the ultimate good has come out of the Civil War, at least the freedom of the Negro and the economic freedom of mankind. The theory that one man should live off of the slave labor of another has been wiped out of this country, hasn't it? And if nothing else came out, the fact that never again will one man enslave another, no matter what his color, race, or creed may be. So it isn't for you or for me to judge right now whether the Labour Party of England is the best or the Conservative Party. That's not our function. Our function is to know this, that the government is on his shoulder, that the government is Christ, and that Christ, the Word, appears as flesh, made manifest humanly as harmony, wholeness, for the ultimate good, not necessarily for the good of today, not necessarily for the good of a certain group of people today, even if they happen to be your friends and relatives, but that the Christ is made manifest for the ultimate good. And for our authority, we go back to Jesus, where in spite of his evident love for the Hebrew people, he did nothing to tear them away from their church organization, and he did nothing to tear them away from the government of Rome. Nothing. He refused to be a general of the army. He refused to set himself up to start a war by force to bring about good. No, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. He was not interested in their immediate freedom. He probably was a wise enough man to know that the Hebrews had been freed many times and had always gotten back into slavery in one way or another, and that if they were freed again, it would only be to go back into slavery again unless they were freed through Christ. I love this. It's one of my dearest memories of a very wonderful lady. One of Mrs. Eddy's earliest students at the very beginning of her ministry was a little lady from Detroit, Michigan. And she became the first practitioner, one of the first, out in Detroit. And in those early days, practitioners were arrested very frequently and put in jail, more especially if they had a patient who passed on under their care. And little Annie Knott, she was only a tiny little bit of a woman, was picked up one day and thrown into jail. Well, of course, her students came down in a hurry and bailed her out. And she was very grateful to them, thought it was a wonderful gesture. But the next week, she was right back in jail again. And when they came down this time to bail her out, she said, "Oh, no, 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 no. No, you just let me stay right here until I get myself out. When I get out through the activity of the Christ, they'll never get me back here again or any other practitioner. Because once we establish something through the activity of the Christ, it is permanent." And so she stayed right there in the jail until they came of their own accord and released her. And it was the last time she was arrested, and it was the last time any Christian Zionist was arrested in Detroit. Certainly, the resort to human means and modes may be temporarily satisfactory, but it is not our spiritual demonstration. Just the same as an aspirin will undoubtedly stop a headache, most headaches anyhow. But after you've stopped the headache, what then? You still have the possibility of another one. Whereas, stop that headache through the spiritual activity of the Christ, and you are healed. That is one of the principles behind the story of our Hebrew patriarch, who wrestled with error all night and would not let it go from him until it brought him a blessing. No, depart not from me until I have a blessing. And many a person who has been ill has prayed that same prayer. God, don't take this illness from me until I know enough not to let it happen again. Don't take this illness from me until I've learned the spiritual truth of being. I don't want physical health. Well, if I had the most perfect physical health in the world, I could go out there and get hit with a car and have it all done with. The best physical health in the world, and one little bullet or one little germ is apt to upset it. But let me wrestle with this problem until I make the transition from a physical sense of freedom, from a physical sense of health, from a physical sense of wealth, to the spiritual realization, to the activity of the Christ as meeting my every need, and then I'm free. There, too, you have a major premise of ours. When you are freed by the Son, you are free indeed. When you are freed through spiritual activity, through the activity of the Christ in your consciousness, then are you freed indeed. But you may be freed from poverty by an inheritance or a good job. You may be freed from sickness by surgery or medicine. Nobody denies that. But that's not your true freedom. Your true freedom comes when you cannot become sick again. And that is only when you have realized health or harmony as the activity of the Christ in your consciousness. That is why the way of the infinite way, you read it all through the writings, is not one of improving humanhood. It is not one of changing the date on your tombstone and putting it off for a few years. It is not one of changing physical disease into physical health. It is not one of changing physical lack into physical abundance. No. No, the activity of the infinite way goes back to the ministry of Jesus Christ, in which he said, not I have improved the world, I have overcome the world. My kingdom is not of this world. Now you see, if his kingdom had been of this world and of improving humanhood, think how differently that ministry would have been conducted. There would have been free food kitchens all across the Holy Lands, and his disciples would have been out every day multiplying loaves and fishes for the people. None of that happened. Only 3 times in his ministry did he show forth the miracle of multiplying loaves and fishes. Why? Because he wasn't interested in the Hebrew people eating regularly. He was interested in their learning a principle which would enable them to have good throughout their entire experience. If he had merely wanted them to be healthier, he could have set up a ministry of healing all across the Holy Land with practitioners, with disciples and apostles, and said, here, take your post at the busiest street corner and heal these people. But he didn't. He didn't. He healed them only to show them that there is a principle of health. Now then, in our ministry too, we want everybody to be healthy, wealthy, and wise, but not healthy, wealthy, and wise in a physical sense, but through the realization that the activity of Christ in individual consciousness is our freedom from discord. There is our freedom. The activity of Christ in consciousness is our freedom from discord, inharmony, lack, and limitation. And once we have been touched in consciousness by that Christ, then are we free indeed. And how do we bring it about? This constant activity of truth in our consciousness, this constant living, moving, and having our being in it, and not merely when we're here for a week of classes or 2 or 3. Don't forget, it's been a marvelous thing when you stop to think that we've had 2 and 3 sessions a day all last week and again this week. You'll say, my error certainly has been crowded out of my thought for that period, and my mind has been occupied with truth, with Christ. Ah, yes. But is there to be a letdown next week? There will be a letdown of the public meetings. But will there be a letdown in the activity of Christ in your consciousness? And I can't determine that for you. That is where your part of classwork comes in. You have to determine that. I'll promise you this. There will be no lessening of the activity of Christ in my consciousness when this week's over. I will be as busy with this truth, even if I am not, and I'm not scheduled for any talks next week, but I'll be just as busy with it in my upper story as if I were on a platform every minute. Why? Because the activity of truth and consciousness is my freedom. Now, I don't mean this, that we have to go around making affirmations and denials all day. Oh, no. That only comes about for a few weeks, at most a few months, until it has become a habit. Don't forget this. We have formed the habit. Well, this isn't 100% true in the case of truth students, but very often it comes too near being the truth. I can't help thinking when I see crowds out at going to ball games and movie theaters and things like that, of thinking of them as the walking dead. They're walking, they're eating, they're sleeping. But what's going on beside that? Nothing, just a dull, dead monotony. Funny papers, sport pages, comics, detective stories. Dullness and deadness is the average of the human life of today. It's the walking dead, and many of them look like it too. Truth students have come out and become separate to some degree. They fill some part of their day with the activity of truth, either reading, meditating, pondering, treating. But take my word for it, not enough. Not enough. For several months, we should fill ourselves as full of truth as we have been doing here last week and this week. That should go on for months and months and months, even if we haven't a meeting to go to, until it becomes so automatic that every time we pick up a book, even if it isn't a Bible or a metaphysical book, we hit upon a truth. Nothing could have surprised me more than to open this book to a statement of Walt Whitman's and find him saying in there, I wonder if I can locate it. Wait a minute. This is interesting. Yeah. Walt Whitman says, silent and amazed even when a little boy, I remember I heard the preacher every Sunday put God in his statements as contending against some being or influence. Is that wonderful? Think of it. There's something now, one thought that could occupy us very profitably for the next 3 months. Is God a power? Do we accept God in our statement as a power that is going to overcome sin, disease, death, lack, or limitation? Or have we come far enough in our truth studies as to really know that God is the only power and that none of these things out here are power at all? No matter what the appearance is. That we don't have to fight them, we don't have to contend with them, we don't have to overcome them. We have to sit quietly in the secret place and just realize they're not power. Why, just one little verse of Walt Whitman's could well occupy us for days, weeks, and months until we ourselves come into that realization that he had even as a boy, that we're making a terrible blunder if we are using truth to overcome error. If we are using God to overcome sin or disease or lack, if we're turning to God for that purpose, we are making the same mistake that old theology is making. Praying to God to do something that it can't do. I remember one of those experiences that played a part in national politics, though I had no idea of it, didn't intend it, didn't think of it. It was in the days of my practice in Boston, and I had been called to a lady who was confined to bed, had been for 2 years, and she knew nothing of truth, and there was very little I could say to her that would make any impression on her. So I would call on her every Thursday and just sit by her bedside, be silent a little while, and say a couple of words to her and leave. And on this particular day, I came in and sat there, got very silent, and all of a sudden, my thoughts commenced to wander in a different direction entirely. And I pulled out all of the papers, which we usually carry with us. All men, I guess, have that habit. And I started to write. And I filled up every envelope, front and back, inside, outside, all the papers I had. It was just pouring out. When I read it, it was something that I myself could never have done. Never. It was a long, long, long poem. And it was called, If You Were God. Now, the purpose of it was, if you were God and your people prayed, looked up to you for food and fuel and clothes, this was the early part of the Depression, what would you say? And of course the answer comes back clearly. Don't look up to me. I can't do anything for you. Your hills are filled with cattle. Your land is filled with crops. Your soil is filled with iron, oil, steel. What more can I add to your world? Look to the men who are destroying it, who are plowing it under, who are giving it away, who are carting it out to the ocean in barges so that you can't get it. Don't look to me. What can I do? I've done it. Well, it went on that way, verse after verse, 4 pages of it, 4 printed pages of it. And after it was printed, I thought, now what am I going to do with it? I had nothing to do with it. I wasn't in politics, had no interest in it. So I sent a few to friends that I thought would like to see that I had written a poem. Well, it just so happened that one of my friends was a Christian Science practitioner in Detroit through whom I received my first illumination. And I sent him a copy. And lo and behold, when the mailman gave it to him, Senator Vandenberg's personal attorney was sitting in his office. So he read this thing and looked at it and handed it to Mr. Vandenberg's attorney. He said, "What do you make of this?" And this fellow read it. He said, "Oh, my God, where'd you get that? I want that." Well, he said, "One of my friends wrote it." "Well, you find out if we can reprint it." And so they got me on the telephone. I said, "You can do anything you want with it. I don't know where it came from or why. I don't know what its purpose on earth is." And, well, they had thousands of copies of it made, and Mr. Wallace never did become vice president the next time. And then Mr. Wallace and his vice presidency and his presidency and his plowing under program and all the rest of it. Well, if that served any purpose of God, I'm very, very grateful. It certainly had nothing to do with me as a person, because that wasn't my problem. While I certainly was never in favor of plowing under or keeping prices high so that poor people can't get food, still it wasn't my business to butt into the political world where I had no power. But evidently, this thing coming through was meant for some such purpose, and it did have that effect. There's any question about that. They distributed so many copies that it finally went to President Roosevelt, and he says, "We can't put that man up on a ticket with that thing to do, because they'll even get God after him." When they bring God into politics, it's bad business. Well, that's exactly what I mean then. As we fill consciousness with the activity of truth, it comes forth, and we don't always have to engage in the human battles of the world, but we do bring forth spiritual activity, and it translates itself in some human way. And so the words of Jesus, the message of Jesus, the mission of Jesus, which was a purely spiritual one, has come down through history, and it is responsible, as you well know, for breaking up of slavery. It is responsible for a greater degree of the brotherhood of man on earth. And there, too, you mustn't be fooled by appearances. Don't think because the world is battling itself now in what looks like a lot of wars, that it means there is a lessening of man's love for man, of the brotherhood of man. Not at all. There has never been a time, I don't believe, in the history of the entire world when there has been the degree of the brotherhood of man established on earth as there is this minute. That which you see as world unrest, as world wars, is merely the plotting and planning of a few hundred men in high places keeping the rest of the world stirred up. If you could see these people underneath, if you could be in these parts of the world where the different races and religions, colors and creeds are mixing, you would find a greater degree of the brotherhood of man than you ever dreamed possible on the face of the earth. Oh no, there is a love between us, and that same love between us is out there toward the rest of the city of Portland, and the rest of it is toward Seattle and so on through the country, up into Canada, down into Hawaii, and across the waters, and I who travel am in a position to see it. The only discord and inharmony in the world is today the plotting and planning of the schemers in high places. Don't ever forget that. The level of love on the level of humanity has never been as great. The level of tolerance, of understanding, of lack of bigotry has never been to the degree that it is today. There is still one wide cleavage, but that will have to be settled some other time in another way. But on the whole, you watch, even in the countries where the Japanese are, if you could see the love for